some people are coming online right now. Hi, everybody. In the chat, would love to hear where you guys are all from. So find the chat in the bottom, tell us where you're from. Thanks for joining us in the second video webinar in the series for Language Adventure Pros, focusing on Mexican language and culture. And thank you all who donated to the Latin American Relief Fund. The goal right now is to purchase the Abbott House in Celaya, which is the migrant safe house. And so if you haven't already donated, please go back to our website, Language Adventure Pros webinars, and make sure you donate to that cause. Everything from this webinar goes straight to LARF. So thank you all for that already donated and those that do in the future. Today we have Bill LeVasseur. He is the founder and owner of the Mask Museum in San Miguel de Allende. Bill is from Presque Island, Maine, and grew up in the New York City suburbs. And although his early accomplishments include being in a rock band, he actually had a Decca Records contract in the late 60s, so you can search for that on YouTube. And he also has a beautiful wife, Heidi, and 3 kids and many grandchildren, and we know that some of you are online right now. So where does Mexican mask come into play? So after recognizing his average musical talent, Bill decided that he would die of starvation if he tried to be a musician for life, and joined an advertising agency. Part of one of his assignments, or his biggest assignment during that, was to be located in Mexico City. So he was in Mexico City on assignment, and over 30 years spent time in Mexico City and in Brussels. So Bill and Heidi converted a bed and breakfast in San Miguel de Allende to a bed and breakfast and a mask museum called Casa de la Cuesta. And so Bill's been collecting ceremonial masks for as long as he's been in Mexico, which is over 30 years, and has traveled extensively to see and film dance ceremonies and acquire masks. His mask collection hobby has now become an avocation to document and share the indigenous ceremonial customs with mask museum visitors, college audiences, and importantly, Mexican school children. Bill's wife Heidi would classify and characterize his interest in this subject as an addiction for which he needs immediate medical attention. So the museum, another face of Mexico, opened to the public in February of 2006. And I'm here in Bill's workshop, and Bill is out in his museum, and we are so happy to welcome Bill LeVasseur of the Mask Museum of San Miguel de Allende.
Me?
Yes, you.
Wait, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Ginger. I wrote it just exactly like I wrote it. Welcome to my world, and thank you all for joining this chat this afternoon. I'm going to give you some background on my mask collection, and we're going to do a video tour of the museum. I'm in the museum right now, but we're going to take a walk through the museum in a couple of minutes. And as Ginger mentioned, I've been collecting Mexican ceremonial masks as long as I've been in Mexico, and that's about 30 years. What happened when we moved to Mexico City from New York, I met in a social event, I met a Mexican gentleman who was a professor of anthropology and a mask collector. So my first exposure to Mexican ceremonial masks was through the eyes of an anthropologist, and I just found masks to be interesting aesthetically, but more importantly, the stories behind the mask, how they're used, why they're used, and the history of masking just became a hobby that sort of morphed. It sort of morphed into a hobby on steroids, and so I've been dedicated to traveling to rural indigenous Mexico. Are those folks hearing this echo that I'm hearing? Or is that...
I need to move away from you.
Okay, excuse me. I'm sorry. There's echo here. It's it's probably because of the vodka. Anyway, so I set the collection up in a space that I humbly call a museum, and that was, as Ginger mentioned, that was in 2006, and so the museum's been open to the public for quite a while, and all the masks that I've collected by traveling to rural indigenous Mexico have been purchased in indigenous villages. Very often you can't buy the mask because masks are very often part of the family, and that has to be respected. But nonetheless, I've been doing this for such a long time that I've managed to acquire what I would consider to be a fairly good representation of the different types of ceremonies, not the different types of masks. There are thousands, literally thousands of villages in Mexico where indigenous cultures celebrate their fiestas normally around the Catholic liturgical calendar, incidentally. Christmas, Easter, Carnival, Day of the Dead, Feast of the Holy Cross, Feast of the Assumption, Feast of the Virgin of Guadalupe, etc., etc. And mask ceremony is an important part of fiesta in indigenous Mexico. I characterize indigenous Mexicans as being party-prone people. They're always looking for an excuse to celebrate themselves and their sense of cultural pride and cultural identity, which is very strong. And so I think before I babble on any further, when you go through the museum, and it's about a 2-minute walkthrough that I shot on my iPhone a few months ago and put some spooky music behind the walkthrough. As you're going through the museum, keep in mind that all the masks you're going to be looking at have been used in ceremony. These masks are not made to be sold to the public. They're made in local villages by local mask makers, and sometimes santeros, the people who make saints for the churches, sometimes supplement their income by making masks. And so all the masks you're going to see in the museum are performance masks. They're in that sense, I consider them to be authentic. And they're all post-Hispanic. There's no masks in the museum that are pre-conquest. Those masks would be over 500 years old, and they would not have survived had they been hidden away from the eyes of the Spaniards and the Catholic friars. They would have deteriorated by now. So let's take a walk through the museum, and I'll come back and talk to you about masking and mask ceremony. So that's the collection. There's about roughly 600 masks in the collection. I just want you to enjoy a couple of quotes from a couple of authors that give you some context. and this is Earl Shores, who wrote a wonderful book called The Life and Times of Mexico. Horrible title, wonderful book. It's history, but it's written like a novel, and it's very easy to read. He says that Mexico is an Indian country. By the way, the word Indian is, I would never say Indian, it's an indigenous country. More than 12% of the population claims to be purely indigenous, and the majority is mestizo. The rest of the population are mestizo, culturally mixed, genetically indigenous, European or African. There's a mixture, a blood mixture. Whoever doesn't understand this indigenous aspect and its effect on the hearts and minds of Mexicans really can't grasp the idea of Mexico even now in the 21st century. And what is indigenous is another quote from Alan Sandstrom. Is that up, Ginger? The quote from Sandstrom. Who decides if you're indigenous? Well, the answer is you do. An Indian or indigenous person is someone who identifies himself or herself as such, chooses to use an indigenous language in daily speech, remains actively involved in village communal affairs, participates in religious ceremonies, often rooted in native traditions, and attempts to achieve a harmony with rather than control over the social and natural world. So that's a pretty good definition of indigenous. And in the just so you understand, in the census, the Mexican census, the last census was conducted in 2010. There are roughly 12% of the population. When asked the question in the census, what is your nationality? ¿Cuál es su nacionalidad? That's the question that's asked in the census, did not say Mexican. They responded by saying, yo soy Otomí, somos Nahuas, nosotros somos Huichol, or what a number of different indigenous subcultures create this sense of indigenousness. And if it's quite interesting, if you think that Mexico has been wholesale converted since the arrival of the Spaniards and the Catholic friars almost 500 years ago. It's been 500 years since Mexico has been moving very nicely toward the 21st century, and yet in the census, more than 1 out of 10 households, 12% of the household base in the last census, when asked the question, what is your nationality, didn't say Mexican. They immediately think, I suppose, they think they're being asked, what is your indigenous cultural lineage? That's perhaps how they interpret the question in the census, and respond by identifying with a very specific subculture. And what drives this cultural identity in Mexico, and this is based on my observations. Incidentally, I didn't tell you this. I didn't tell you about my credentials. I don't have any. I am not an anthropologist. I've never taken a course in anthropology. I just have this deep interest in understanding indigenous culture, and particularly mask ceremony, of course. But what has happened over the last 500 years, that the reason these individuals who identify as being indigenous do so is because they've been marginalized. And there's been a creation of a sense of other. They've become the other. Initially at the conquest, the native populations who weren't needed as indentured slaves on haciendas or encomiendas. The friars were given huge land grants by the King of Spain, called encomiendas, and the people who lived on those, the natives who lived on those encomiendas, belonged to the conquistador. But the people who weren't needed were marginalized. They were told to live over here. We don't want you. They're marginalized geographically, and often told to live on land that is not near water, that's often more vertical than horizontal, but they've managed to survive. So the native population has been marginalized geographically from the very beginning, and over the last 500 years, these people have been marginalized socially and culturally and educationally and economically. So there's, in sort of a naive way, there's two Mexicos. There's the Mexico that you'd see in Mexico City or Acapulco, and then there's this other Mexico that I travel to frequently to see the ceremonies. I'm very often in villages where they don't speak Spanish. They can, most people can, but they don't use their Spanish. They use a native language. In any case, so this sense of cultural identity is born from this, what I call just marginalization. People find refuge in their cultural identity. And that's still going on today, and probably will go on for a long time to come. Speaking of where do these people live, I think you're looking at a map. If you look at the red area, this is Mexico. By the way, this is a census projection from 1970. I don't have one for the last census in 2010. They didn't publish this map, but if they did, it would look just like this. The native population in Mexico is largely concentrated in central and southern Mexico. And that's where I do most of my traveling, most of my research, most of my acquiring masks. The reason the native population is located where they are is a consequence of two factors. When people were migrating, when humans were inhabiting this hemisphere, migrating from Asia over the frozen over Iberian Peninsula, the Bering Straits, during the Pleistocene, the Ice Age, and migrating south, they tended to stay in that red area, not in the other area of northern Mexico, largely because of rainfall and soil fertility. All of southern Mexico, central and southern Mexico, was formed by volcanic activity and plate tectonic activity during the middle Miocene. This is on the exam later, folks, just so you know. The middle Miocene is 11 to 17 million years ago, and that's when this part of Mexico was formed. The soil composition is volcanic, which means it's more fertile than the limestone, largely singularly limestone soil in the northern part of the country. So you've got a very, very dense concentration of indigenous culture in central and southern Mexico. And in fact, all the major civilizations that have ever been discovered by archaeologists and anthropologists, going back to the Olmec, which is 2,000 years BC, then Toltec, Aztec, Purépecha, Zapotec, Totonac, and Maya. All those civilizations are in that red area where you see. And by the way, I'm in San Miguel de Allende, right in the middle of the country, and I'm standing right now on 6,300 feet of igneous extrusion and lava flow. Ginger just pointed out Guanajuato, where the state of Guanajuato, where we are right now. So that's where the indigenous population is concentrated. There are, another fact you should understand, there are 62 different native languages still spoken in Mexico today. I mentioned I'm often in villages where they don't speak Spanish. I don't speak native languages. I do all my research, all my purchasing, my negotiation for masks in Spanish. I have met people in my travels that don't speak Spanish, and they tend to be old men, older men, proud old men who may speak Spanish, but they won't speak Spanish with me. They're too proud, and so meanwhile they're watching the soccer game on TV in Spanish, but they won't. There are again, there are 62 different languages. The largest native language spoken in Mexico today is called Nahuatl. It was the language spoken by the Aztecs. There are 2.2 million people in Mexico that identify as being Nahuatl. And 1.6 million of those people speak the language. So that's a little background on the size and scope of indigenous population in Mexico. The masking in this part of the world in Mexico. By the way, while I'm talking to you, Ginger's going to be showing you all kinds of masks that are in the museum, so you don't have to look at my shiny forehead for the presentation. But masking was a very, very important activity in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, and going back as far as we know to the Olmecs. And masking was, masks were used more for shamanic or spiritual purposes. Masks were very typically represented spirits or deities or gods in the belief system of the native population in Mexico or Mesoamerica. And of course, when the Spaniards arrived to Christianize, to evangelize, the church passed edicts forbidding the use of masks that represented the spirits of the native population. Most of those masks were destroyed outright by the friars and the Spaniards because they represented a belief that was antithetical to the Christian Catholic stories that the friars were telling. What happened was and interestingly, and I think fortunately for us today, initially when the friars came to Christianize, they couldn't communicate with their audience. And they basically co-opted or took advantage of the indigenous fondness for the behavior of masking and started making masks to represent characters in Bible stories in order to teach the Bible story theatrically. And that has now been going on for 500 years. Many of the masks you'll see today, and if you were visited the museum, represent characters in Bible stories. And so, as I mentioned earlier, Christmas, Easter, Carnival, Day of the Dead, Feast of the Holy Cross, Feast of the Assumption, all these Bible stories are performed by the native population today during the religious holidays. And the most dramatic that I've observed is the reenactment of the Passion of Christ at Easter. It's very popular. All during Holy Week, that whole Bible story is reenacted where there's Christ is weeping in the Garden of Gethsemane because he predicts his fate. There's a Last Supper with 12 apostles, and Judas Iscariot typically wears a very ugly mask because of his role in ratting out, identifying Jesus to the Romans. There is a trial where Pontius Pilate refuses to try Jesus and turns Jesus over to Caiaphas to be tried, and there's this is in the Roman guards, the centuriones, the Roman centurions. These are all masked characters during this Holy Week celebration or reenactment. There are Pharisees, the Fariseos. That's a sect of Jews that didn't agree with Christ's teachings according to the Bible, and they, of course, are according to the story, were partially responsible for Christ's crucifixion. Incidentally, it wasn't until I think the late 60s where the Pope declared that it wasn't the Jews who killed Christ, it was the Romans. It took the Catholic Church about 2,000 years to figure that one out, but I won't do a deep dive into that. So and of course the last character in the reenactment is Barabbas, the thief. You recall from your high school history or whatever, it was custom in the Judea during Christ's time to free a criminal, and Barabbas is that character, also included in the reenactment. So Bible stories are important reenactments today in indigenous Mexico. Masks are also used to reenact historical events like the Conquest, the Dance of the Conquest, where Cortez and the conquistadores are having a fight, a mock battle with Montezuma and the Aztecs. They also, in Puebla, where the battle happened in May 5th, 1862, where the French forces were defeated by the Mexicans, they reenact the Battle of Cinco de Mayo, but incidentally, Cinco de Mayo is not a national holiday. A lot of Americans maybe watching today think that Cinco de Mayo was a big deal in Mexico. It is not. They only do this performance in the two little villages in the mountains of Puebla where the battle actually took place. So, but that is a historic ceremony. There are also a category of dances that are called occupational dances. This is the dance of the cowboys, the charros, the dance of the farmers, the dance of the fishermen. These are performances masked performances that, as best as I can figure out, are paying homage to these people for the work they do. And so those are the categories of masks. I'm going to have Ginger, in the museum on a DVD, there's 15 different dances that I usually run when people are in the museum. We've done an edit, and each of those dances runs 3 or 4 minutes. I'm not going to do that to you, but we have edited those into little bits so you can get a sense of the different types of dances. So we're going to run a few. It takes about 1.5 minutes, and then I'll show you some more dances later on in the presentation. So I mentioned that there are religious reenactments, which is the majority of ceremony, mask ceremony in Mexico, historical dances, occupational performances, and there's two other influences on ceremonial dance that I need to explain to you. And before I do that, I want to frame up history for you, because there's some historical coincidences that have majorly affected dance ceremony in Mexico. These are coincidences in Europe. Just to remind you, Cortez was a Spaniard living in Cuba. He had a hacienda, and I guess his DNA formed his desire to explore. He organized an expedition. 3 ships sailed from Santiago de Cuba, the southern end of the island of Cuba, sailed west to a land that he had heard about from another explorer. And that was in 1519. And they landed in the port in Veracruz and marched inland and to the Aztec capital. And about 2 years later, the Aztec capital fell to the conquistadores. There were about, we're not sure how many, 400 or 500. They had horses, they had guns, blunderbusses that were, and of course, steel, swords, and weapons that the native population had no, and mastiffs, attack dogs. But the Aztec capital fell to the conquistadores and their allies in August of 1521. Now, they had 2 allies. The Cortez, there was an indigenous group called the Tlaxcaltecas in Tlaxcala, Mexico, Tlaxcaltecas, that hated the Aztecs. They had been subjugated by the Aztecs for decades, and Cortez found out about this and aligned himself with the Tlaxcala. So by the time his final thrust into Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, in August of 1521, he had thousands of soldiers behind him or supporting his conquistadores. And the other ally he had was smallpox. The seed of smallpox had been planted probably in the first incursion in 1520 in the Aztec capital, and that was a devastating disease that wiped out a large majority of the Tenochtitlan population. So the Aztec capital fell in August of 1521. Well, just a year and a half from now will be the 500th anniversary of the conquest of Mexico in August of 2021. Okay, just to wrap that up for you, and these are things we learned in high school and got a C on the exam and forgot immediately because it wasn't important to us. But something happened in Europe that of great significance just 2 years before Cortes sailed from Cuba in 1517. You recall that Martin Luther posted his theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg, Saxony. He was an Augustinian monk who had a serious problem with the practice of indulgences that the church was practicing. The Vatican was built on indulgences. You could pay, you could buy a get out of jail free card with the Catholic Church, and Martin Luther had a problem with that. He was immediately excommunicated from the church, but Rome, the Vatican, was hearing about this movement in Northern Europe, in Saxony, and were very concerned that this movement would spread throughout Europe, as it finally did. And at the same time, the Vatican is hearing about this heresy that's going on, and their fear of losing parishioners in Europe. They're hearing back from Pizarro in Peru and Cortes in Mexico. They're hearing back about this discovery of this huge swath of humanity here in this hemisphere that was perfectly ripe to be converted to Christianity, probably to replace the souls that they would be losing in Europe to the Protestant movement. The Calvinism started in, the Calvinist movement started in 1536, incidentally. So, and so the friars were sent here. The Dominicans and Franciscans and Augustinians were sent here right away to Christianize these ripe souls. And as a consequence, the way people were Christianized, the way people were evangelized, Rome probably didn't care too much about what they understood about the tenets of Catholicism, the 10 Commandments, the 7 Sacraments, the things you would get, the catechism lessons you would learn as a good Catholic youngster. They didn't care too much about that. All they were probably cared about was head count. And so the friars, as they were Christianizing and performing dances with masks representing Bible characters, weren't too concerned about eliminating the spirits and deities in the belief system of the natives, and would allow the native population to conflate their spirits with Bible characters. So, for example, Tonatiuh, the spirit of the sun in the Aztec society, was conflated with Jesus, and still is today. Saint John the Baptist is conflated with Tlaloc, the rain god, okay? And on and on and on. So this has created, because of the nature of the process of Christianizing going back 500 years, this has created what is called religious syncretism in Mexico. And it's very evident, particularly in southern Mexico, where the more indigenous populations are concentrated. I've been in Catholic churches where there's a statue of Jesus next to a statue of the spirit of the sun. And so there's this conflation of spirits and deities with Catholic saints and Bible characters. It's quite interesting, and it affects mask dancing, because some of the ceremonies that I see that are ostensibly Christian are mixed up with pre-Columbian belief. It's fascinating to observe that and understand it. So that's a historical coincidence that Martin Luther in 1517 fomented the Protestant Reformation, and it was just 2 years later that Cortes arrived in what is today Mexico. The other significant coincidence, historical coincidence, is the capitulation of the Moors in Spain. Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, had been inhabited by non-Christians for 700 years, Jews, Berbers, and Moors. And the Moorish society, the Moorish culture was evident in Spain, still is in certain parts of Spain. Architecture, for example, Moorish architecture. But the final defeat or final capitulation of the Moors happened in Spain, thus converting the Iberian Peninsula to complete Christian. Many parts of the Iberian Peninsula had been Christianized during the Crusades, but the Crusades ended in 1291. It wasn't until the same year Columbus discovered America, 1492, 200 years later, that the Iberian Peninsula had become completely Christianized. And when the conquistadores came here, came to this part of the world just 30 years later, 1519, just 30 years after the defeat of the Moors, they were still celebrating their victory over the infidels. And they performed, as part of the process of evangelization, they performed the dance of the Moros y Cristianos for the native population here, with absolutely no intent to explain what Islam was to the native population. They were simply here or performing this mock fight between good and evil to dramatize the triumph of Christianity over anything else that you might consider believing in. And so today, all over Mexico, and in fact all over Latin America, the dance of the Moors and Christians, Moros y Cristianos, is a very, very popular ceremony. And it's still, by the way, it's still performed in the Philippines, where there was a Spanish Catholic evangelization. So those are two historical events that have influenced or the ceremonies in Mexico today. I guess let's show you a few more dances, another clips of some more dance ceremonies, the contemporary, and then I'll come back and take some questions from you. If you would like, anybody have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them for you. I'm gonna put up on the screen my website and email address as well, because if any of you want to continue a dialogue, or later on, if you think of a question that you want to ask, you can get in touch with me. And so if anybody has any questions, here I am. Fire away.
Okay, I'm gonna, this is Ginger here. I'm gonna put whoever would like to ask a question, just go ahead and raise your hand, and I will put you over onto video to talk with Bill. First we have Betsy Kalish.
Hello.
Hi, Betsy.
Hi, I submitted a question.
Yes.
Through chat.
Where are you calling from? Where are you?
I'm calling from Philly. I'm a friend of Nancy's.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's really interesting what you have to say. I spend a lot of time in Ecuador, and it's not much different. But my question or request would be, I'd love to see more specific masks if you would give us a little closer look and description of particular masks that do particular things. That's really what I'd love to see. So it's not really a question, it's more of a gentle request.
Yeah, if I do that now, it'll take a couple of hours. So, but I mean, do you want to, here. Can you see that?
Uh-huh.
Okay, that's a Juan Negro. It's called the dance of the Juan Negros. This is Juan el Negro. This is a dance in Veracruz and Hidalgo, where it actually is a, it's kind of a sad story. When the blacks were brought here as slaves, the native women found them very interesting, and the Spaniards became jealous, and they did a dance to teach the natives that it was okay for a Spaniard to cohabitate with a native woman, and not okay for a black. And it is called the dance of the Juan Negros. Now, most people, they still do this dance today. Most people in the villages don't even know that history, and they do it during Catholic holidays. But the basic root of that ceremony is, this is the black man, and the other character, this is Juan, the hacienda owner. This is Juan Negro, the black slave. And there's a woman character in the ceremony. There's only 3 people in this dance. And there's a fight between these 2 characters, right? And he always loses to him. They've been doing this ceremony for probably 500 years. It's called the Dance of the Juan Negros. That's an example. Incidentally, I'm going to go off. Well, what else would you? Can you see these masks?
Yes.
These are called mampos. Mampo these are worn at these are from Chiapas, and these masks are worn during the carnival celebrations in certain villages, Ocosocuautla and Suchiapa, Chiapas, and they are they represent androgynous characters, and basically the natives are spoofing homosexuality. They're making fun of homosexuality as part of carnival. Right? In only politically correct Mexico would they still be doing that. But I could go on. There's 600 masks in the museum. I could go on forever. But the other thing you should know too, and I'm not trying to sell you anything, but there's a museum catalog. This is my book, right? And it has I don't know, 100 different masks in here, all explained in text, right? The use of the mask. So, and if you can get this through me from the publisher in Santa Fe, New Mexico. But yeah, I could do another presentation and just take you through Diablos, take you through different masks and explain the ceremony with the mask in hand. I wouldn't have time to do that now. But since I picked up a Negro mask, an African character, there was a huge importation of black slaves in Mexico in the early colonial period. And of course, they were brought in to the country to replace the natives who were decimated by disease. The hacienda owners, the encomienderos, needed labor, and the blacks were brought in. The blacks had prior exposure to these pathogens in West Africa 200 years prior to the conquest here in this hemisphere. So they were disease resistant, much more disease resistant than the native population. Anyway, I'm sure I didn't do your question justice, so I can send you a book.
You did great.
Bill,
thank you.
Sure.
Bill, we have another question from Carol Romano.
Carol Romano. Hi, Carol.
Carol, are you there?
I'm here. Wait. Let me pull my little thingy off of the.
Hi, Carol.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm well. Here.
Cheers.
Salud.
Cheers.
Excellent presentation. Thank you so much. Really interesting.
I made up most of that shit. Thank you.
Oh, so should I ask my question
Yes, yes.
personally, Ginger? Okay, I was wondering if what I wrote, which sounds confusing to me, do you have a sense of how the indigenous people understand the Christian influence upon their history, in that they have equal belief and appreciation of it, or is there some quote unquote acceptance of the Christian faith totally separate from their true history, and they just kind
Well,
of
they're
put up with it?
The Mexico is Catholic. In the census, they asked the question of religion in the census. 85%, it's down from 89% from the 2000 census because of the influence of the evangelist movement. But still, Mexico is largely Catholic, and they practice the way Catholicism is practiced depends on where you are in the country. As I mentioned earlier, in the southern part of Mexico, Chiapas, Campeche, Tabasco, the Yucatan, in villages that were less influenced by modernity, right? There's a much higher level of syncretism than there is like in San Miguel, for example, where this is a Franciscan town, right? The religious practices don't reflect, as far as I know, they don't reflect pre-Columbian belief. But it's not black or white. It's not like, you know, it could be in the Lacandon jungle and in the Lacandon Indians that borders Guatemala. The friars never got there, right? So that it could be that there's still some, but I've never seen this, so I can't speak to it. There could be villages in that area of Mexico, or perhaps in the Copper Canyon in the northern part of Mexico, Chihuahua, where there's a much higher level of reliance on an animistic religion, pre-Columbian belief, where they believe in the spirits of the earth, the wind, the fire, the sun, the moon. But I'm really not. Again, I'm not able to speak to that any more than I just did. Yeah.
Yeah, I just find it so interesting to watch.
Yeah.
That it's conflicting, you know. And even here in San Miguel,
Well,
there you
yeah,
do
they're
see.
shamans. People use shamans for healing purposes here, right?
Oh, yes, right.
You have an emotional or physical problem, very often you go to a shaman before you know, anyway.
Bill, thank you, Carol.
Welcome.
We have a question from Kate Greenaway. She says, some of the masks look heavy and uncomfortable. How long do performers wear them and how do they stand it?
Where are you? I can't see you.
She
Okay.
just wanted me to read out the question for you.
Okay, good. Yeah, good. Yeah, I have masks that weigh kilos. I mean, you can't see them here, but some of the masks are very heavy, which is why during a fiesta, alcohol is a key ingredient with most of these dancers, most of these performers, and some of the dances go on for hours and hours and hours. So, and masks get abused. They get tossed down, and horns fall off devils and things like that. But masks, I mean, there's little masks like this that hardly weigh anything at all, and there are big masks that weigh maybe 2 or 3 kilos, right, or more. Heavy, thick wooden masks. They often pad the mask behind the mat. They often put cloth or material or leather or sponge behind the mask to protect the face, because there's a lot of movement and the mask rattles around your head. So, but yeah, alcohol seems to solve that problem in many cases.
So we have another question from Jason LeVasseur.
Yes.
He
Yes.
had to hop off, but he asked me to ask you, can you explain how we mask today?
Explain what?
How we mask today, besides COVID masks.
Okay. Yeah. Besides, face coverings dictated by the virus. Yeah, masking in the broadest sense is a universal behavior. Incidentally, only anything you do to yourself that's transformational is masking. A mask does not have to be worn here, right? We tend to think of putting on a mask and covering our face and becoming that character or hiding behind a mask. But anything you do to yourself that's transformational is a form of masking. A kid goes into a drugstore, puts on a cool pair of sunglasses and looks in the mirror. Hey, they're masking, right? If I go out to dinner with my wife tonight to a fancy restaurant, I'll change this mask, right? Because it's not appropriate, right? So anything you do to yourself, and only humans can mask, by the way. So anything you do to yourself, that when you get up in the morning and you get dressed, you're probably not thinking very much about what you're doing, but you're making a conscious or semi-conscious or perhaps unconscious decision as to how you want to see yourself today and how you want other people to see you. You're masking. And you may change your mask during the day depending on the social interaction. And masking requires an audience of one, at least. There has to be an audience of one, right, to get that feedback. And that one could be a mirror. But masking requires, so that's a general, Jason, by the way, is my son, who asked that question. But we think of masks at Halloween or whatever, or facial protection. If you're a welder, you're wearing a mask. That's a completely different, that's a functional protection of your face. The COVID mask is not something you're wearing because it's transformational, right? And only humans, they've done experiments with chimpanzees. It's quite interesting. They've done experiments with chimps, highly intelligent animal, right? That you can show a chimpanzee a well-carved mask of a predator animal, a leopard or a hyena, right? And the chimp will freak out. They will see it for what it is, right? But if you manage to get that mask on a chimp in front of a mirror, all you've been able to do is animate the predator. Now the damn thing is moving, and it's worse, right? The chimp cannot make that transition from, oh, I'm me, and I'm changing my persona by virtue of putting on something over my head. It's quite interesting. Chimps can hide behind a tree and they know you can't see them, but they can't mask. Only humans can do that. We're the only species that's intelligent enough, well, with the exception of a couple of people in the West Wing, to actually be able to mask. Any other questions?
We have a question from Sharon Davidson. She says, are there any significant animal masks that relate to a village's specific animal myths?
Animal myths. Animal masks tend to be worn for disguise at carnival. I'm not sure. Well, no. A jaguar, a jaguar. A jaguar was a sacred animal, along with a deer and an eagle. These masks were, in pre-Columbian society, were worn for spiritual purposes or shamanic purposes, and still today, jaguar masks are worn. The jaguar has two associations that are very strong in ceremonial mask ceremony today. The first association is power. The jaguars are feared, right? They're big, strong. They kill domestic animals. They can attack a human, so they're powerful and strong. But they were also related to, jaguars came from the mountains, from the caves up in the mountains where the rain came from, where the clouds formed and the rains came from. So they are associated with fertility, rain, water, right? So they had two very strong associations, and they still are used in many, many ceremonies today. I can show you one if you hang on just a sec. This is can you see that okay? This is a Jaguar mask from Chilapa, Guerrero, okay? And it's typical of, right? These are real pig tusks from a wild boar, and those are the wild boar teeth. These are the bristles from a wild boar, the boar bristle. It's what artists love their paintbrushes to be, pig bristle paintbrushes. No? So that's the first animal associated with myth that I can, that comes to mind. Many animal masks are worn just simply for disguise at carnival. Carnival ceremonies are, you're wearing a mask at carnival so that people don't know it's you, so that you can misbehave. You can do things and say things in your village that you would never dare to do or say any other time of the year. And very often the mask that's being worn is an animal. Okay, any other questions?
Bill.
And I'll take any more questions you might have.
I have a couple questions.
Yeah, Kathy.
Yeah, this is Kathy Signer up in Montana. I don't know if you, there I am. Hey.
How are you?
I've been in San Miguel a couple of times, but I haven't had the pleasure of visiting your museum yet, but I'm going to fix that when I get down there this winter.
Oh, great.
I have two questions for you. One, you have so many masks there, but is there one that you've always wanted to find? Maybe something scarce or something unusual that you've always had an eye out for that you haven't found yet? That's my first question.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, the museum is a pretty good representation of the different types of dances, but there are thousands of villages in Mexico where local mask makers will make a character.
Mm-hmm.
It could be the same character in a ceremony that's performed in nearby villages, but his interpretation of that character could be quite different.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple of masks in Huistan, Chiapas, that I would kill to have, but it's a very, very, yeah, I don't mean that literally.
I hope not. Well,
yeah.
and oh, go ahead.
Huistan, Chiapas, yeah, they're leather masks that are they're beautiful. I've never been able to get there. You have to fly from Mexico City to the capital city of Chiapas, Tuxtla Gutiérrez. Then you have to get on a bus and go, 4 hours, and then get on a horse and go up to the mountain, So yeah, but yeah, and I've seen pictures of masks and other, Mexican masks in books that I love to have. And I like masks that are old, they have a lot of juice, a lot of spirit, they've been used over and over and over again. And they typically show signs of wear and tear, but I like that. I like masks that would have really nice patina, and layers and layers of paint that over the years gets chipped away. And I never try to cosmetically make a mask look, if a horn falls off a mask, I would put it back on. But no, the village where I would love to go is Huistan, Chiapas. Yeah. Yeah. What's your second question?
One last question, which is, have you made any plan, either if you leave Mexico or you leave the planet, to maintain the collection and preserve the collection intact?
Yeah. Thank you for asking. I have 3 sons. We just spoke to one of them, or I answered the question from one of them a minute ago. The boys, I've discussed this at great length. The museum's going to stay right here. The collection's going to stay right here when I'm not around. That's the plan. There have been 2 different universities that I won't name that have shown an interest in the collection, but they would be happy to take it. These are universities in the States, but in both cases, the university would be happy to take the collection donated with endowment, right? So, we'll love to have your masks, Bill, and $100,000 a year in perpetuity would be just fine to maintain the collection and curate it and keep the lights on in the building. So, yeah. So the museum, it's going to stay right here.
Great, wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So Bill, we have a question from Andrea Kay. She says, what do blue eyes represent, good or bad?
Blue eyes? Very often, can you see that?
Yeah.
Can you see the blue eyes?
Yeah, we can.
Right? Blue eyes are very often used in depictions of Europeans. And a few of the ceremonies actually make fun. They spoof Europeans, the clergy, wealthy people who tend to be Caucasian or light skin. And very often they use blue for the eyes. I have never seen a mask of a Mexican indigenous person with blue eyes. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
This is a general question from Amelia Mendoza. She says, can you talk about the regional areas and their typical masks?
You remember the map where I showed you where the indigenous population is concentrated? The indigenous cultures, it's hard to answer that question because many of the indigenous cultures aren't geographically homogeneous. I can tell you exactly where the Tarahumaras live, and I can tell you exactly where the Huicholes live. I can tell you exactly where the Zoques are, but in many of these indigenous societies are in different parts of Mexico because they were traders before the conquest. There are 32 states in Mexico. The Nahuas, there are Nahua populations in 16 of the 32 states. And because of the efforts of the friars to evangelize, the same stories are being reenacted in these different parts of Mexico. Again, the mask might be different, the costumes might be different, the music underneath the ceremony might be different, but the story told by the mask ceremony is the same. I'm not sure how to answer that question. There aren't types of masks that are, well, there are masks that are unique to certain unique to certain character. This mask here is from Chiapas, right? You wouldn't find a mask like that anywhere else but Chiapas. But the stories could be could be told the same with the same performances in different parts of Mexico, and the mask would be very different. I'm not sure I answered your question. I'm pretty sure I did. I'm pretty sure I didn't.
Bill, we have Marilee with another question. She looks like she's up in San Francisco.
Yes, Bill, when you were talking about the synchronization, and it seemed, I used to live in San Miguel, and it seems to me the church up on above Civic Plaza, is that La Salud?
The Plaza Civica, yeah.
Has around its doorways some indigenous symbols, figures,
Yes, it does.
right there in a good old Catholic church.
That's right. That's right. And that's when that church was built. There's a reference to the Pame culture and the Otomi culture and blacks. There's a representation in that carving of black slaves. Yeah, it's quite interesting. But the religion going on inside the church, I doubt very much has any of those traces of pre-Columbian belief. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Nice bridge.
I'm in Chicago, actually.
Oh, hey, you fooled me.
Okay, Bill, we have a question from Lydia Jane Faline, and she says, what would you consider to be the most interesting mask in the collection? What's the oldest mask in the collection? What's the scariest mask in the collection? And what's the first mask you acquired? I'm
going to go backwards. The first mask, and you'll have to remind me of the different questions, but the first mask I acquired, I bought in a flea market in Mexico City, and I showed it to my mentor, the person, the anthropologist, professor of anthropology, that was my mentor for years, and he looked at it and sort of frowned and said no. And I said, it looks to me to be authentic. And he said, He said, there's no, he said, Bill, he said, there's no way that mask could be worn because there's no holes on the side here or on the top where it could be strapped on. He said, it might have been made by a mask maker in a native village with an intention of being performed, but there's no way you could put a strap on that mask to put it on. So be very careful the next time. So that was my first mask. I don't have it anymore. I gave it to somebody. I gave it away, I guess. I have the second mask I ever bought. That's in the museum. It's a panther, pantera, a black jaguar mask. What was the scariest mask?
There was the scariest mask.
Is this one here? What was the other question there? Next question.
The oldest mask. Did you answer that one?
The oldest mask I have is it's a hermit, ermitaño, and it is about 220 years old. And by the way, there's no way to know how old a mask is. I have been in villages where I found a mask to be particularly interesting. It's got wonderful patina. It's worm-eaten in the back of the mask. You can see where the termites had attacked it, years ago. And you look at it and it's got to be 50 or 75, maybe 100 years old. And you ask the person who's willing to sell it how old it is, and they'll say, "Oh, la máscara es nueva, señor." It's new, right? Because that's what they think you want to hear. Right? There's no way to, all the masks in the museum are they've been painted with commercial paints. These aren't, Sherman met Williams in 1840 or something. We've had commercial paints, right? Going back, way back. There's really no way to date a mask. Carbon-14, forget it. That measures carbon-14 decline every 3,500 years, 1 degree of decline. There's no way to know. Mask makers, I think rarely or almost never put a date in the mask when they carve it, right? And so there's really no way to know how old a mask is. I represent one of my masks as being about 220 years old, simply because I believe the story that was told to me by the person who I bought it from, right? And the story was, oh, this is my great-grandfather's mask. He was born in this year and he died in this year, and I simply extrapolated from the story. This was 20 years ago. I simply extrapolated from the story he told me that the mask would have been about 200 years old, and that was 20 years ago. But there's really no way to know. I have another mask that on the nose of the mask, it says "Long live Que viva Carnaval 1944, Long live Carnival 1944. It's on the nose of the mask. It's a carnival mask from Veracruz. So 1944 was 75 years ago. So I know that mask is at least 75 years old, but the mask could have been 50 years old before they wrote on the nose. See? So what scariest mask? Diablos, they're all, right? Tongue sticking out, horns, right? Teeth, right? They're all scary. Scary, oldest?
Scary, oldest, first one.
First.
And what would you consider being most interesting?
Oh, for me, this is anthropology. I look at this as no, I don't have there's no mask that falls into that category. I see this as a sort of a broad range of study. Yeah.
All right, Bill, we have a question from Louisa. She's up in the top there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't raise my hand, Bill.
Oh, hi.
I'm
Hi.
with my granddaughter.
Hi. How are you?
Bill.
Happy.
Meet you at the Berlin bar.
Yeah.
I just love your mask collection. So anyone you want to show and talk about and where it's from.
Bill, now that we have two ladies on screen, there was a question about whether women were involved in masking.
Oh, that's a good question. Masking tends to be male, and that's kind of around the world. That's largely because masking started in hunter-gatherer societies going back thousands of years. it occurred to humans as we were going through a cognitive revolution. I don't know if any of you have read *Sapiens*, the book, but humans went through a cognitive revolution, cranial development, 20 to 30,000 years ago. And as hunters, men were the hunters. And it occurred to them along the route of cognitive development that if they looked and acted and smelled like the animal they were pursuing, they'd be more successful. And that's how masking actually started. And that was male. And that's pretty much been, in societies, there's always exceptions to rules, right? There are lots of masks that are in certain epochs in certain societies, Greek and Roman times, that women wore masks. But in general, mask making, mask carving, and mask use generally is male. There's one ceremony that I know of where women wear masks in Mexico, but it's unusual. And the other, at Carnival, in villages that have been encroached upon by modernity, where, you know, the village has now been sort of absorbed by a larger city or society. During Carnival celebrations, I've seen women wear masks. They put on a mask, they grab a can of beer, and they dance in the street with their boyfriend or their husband, or first their boyfriend, then their husband, I don't know. But masking generally is male, all right? In the No Theater in Japan, the mask of a woman worn by a man. Did you want to?
Okay, Bill, we have a question from Andrew.
Hey,
Hey,
that's
Dad.
another one of my sons.
Dad, can you talk about how sort of this history is being preserved today and whether there's broader cultural representation or significance among sort of younger generations in Mexico?
Boy, I wish that were true. I mean, in this one of the reasons I have visits school groups come to the museum frequently, and from not just San Miguel, from other parts of nearby parts of Mexico, and it's quite clear to me that the teachers don't understand how this fits into history, and it's not part of the school curriculum. It's almost as like Cortez arrived. The native population died of disease or destroyed, and now we march toward independence from Spain, right, in 1810. There's not a lot dealt with, as far as I know, in the school curriculum, the public school curriculum, about contemporary indigenous society and the influence they have on Mexico, right? Which is a shame, because all of Mexico today, what makes Mexico Mexico is the influence of indigenous society. Whether it's music or folk art or story or legend or what colors Mexico is that food, particularly food, right? What colors Mexico, what makes Mexico Mexico is this influence of indigenous culture, and it bleeds out into the rest of society. So I'm not sure I answered that question, but it's unfortunate that I don't think there's a pod in the educational program where kids are learning today that there's 12% of the population are claimed to be indigenous, and the majority of those people actually speak a native language in their village, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I wish it were true.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good to see you. That's Richmond, Virginia, folks. Richmond. All right. Any other questions?
Hi, Bill, this is Ginger. I don't see any more questions.
Okay. Well, good. Then we should wrap.
Sorry, it's Rebecca. There were some comments about whether you would be willing to do a part 2 of walking through the museum and a themed walk, like specific regions or some sort of theme.
That's a whole different presentation, and I'd love to do it.
Okay, great.
Let's do it tomorrow.
We actually we have one more question from Victor Weiser.
Victor, yes.
Yeah, I'm gonna just put him on unmute.
Okay, super.
Victor?
Hi, how are you today?
Hi, Victor.
How are you?
Thanks for joining the chat.
Oh, I've enjoyed that portion I have seen. I wish I had seen more. Is it recorded, Bill? Will I be able to see the full chat or?
It is recorded. I don't know how I get it to you, but I'll talk to my head of production, my technical.
Head of production over here. Victor, all the recordings of this webinar and all of our webinars are available on languageadventurepros.com on the webinars page, and we'll type it in the chat.
Thanks very much. And my real question to you, and I need to thank my friend Kim Malcolm for alerting me of this. My real question was purely selfish. I have a couple of masks and I know nothing about them. And I was wondering if I could just show them, and if you
I'll put.
We're gonna put up my email and website. You send me an email with those pictures, and if I know about the masks, I won't BS you if I don't know about it, or I'll tell you. But people frequently send me photographs of masks so that I can provide provenance. So I'll be happy to do that, Victor. Just write down my my email when it comes up on the screen.
Okay, if I can.
Yeah, and if they're great masks, I'll buy them from you.
No, they're not great. I'm sure they're not. I
actually acquired a couple of masks that way. So.
But great or not, I love them.
Well, that's good. Where are you from? Where are you calling from?
I'm Oakland, California.
Great. Super. There you go.
Whoops, it disappeared.
Here is Bill's information, the museum website, his direct email, and his podcast.
Excellent. Excellent. And I think my friend Kim Malcolm already has this information. So.
Oh, good. Okay.
In fact, she's the one who got the masks for me many, many years ago.
Are they from Mexico?
I believe she thinks they are.
Okay.
But I don't have a clue.
Okay. Great. Super.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, Ginger, or should we wrap it up?
Hi, Bill. It's Rebecca again. I just wanted to, can you hear me?